For the last few months, we've heard plenty about the prospect of a September cliff. Well, we're nearly there because at the end of this month, JobKeeper payments and the Job Seeker supplement will be trimmed. On top of that, the 6-month period of deferral allowing mortgage customers to hit pause on payments is set to end. And at the same time, so too is the national moratorium on evictions. The ACT have enacted a short extension, while Victoria and South Australia have gone a step further, prolonging the eviction ban until the end of March 2021, next year, of course. But has the moratorium done what it was intended to do, and do tenants around the country need this protection beyond September? For more, I'm joined by Patterson Ross, the CEO of the New South Wales Tenants Union, and Antonia, who's the CEO of the Real Estate Institute of Queensland. Thank you to both of you. I'll start with you, Leo. What has the moratorium done for renters? Has it been successful in your opinion?
Thanks, PK. Look, the moratorium has prevented a large number of people being evicted into the street in the middle of a health pandemic, but it hasn't prevented a whole lot of people being really badly harmed financially by the crisis and being forced to move, not because of an eviction notice necessarily, but because of the financial circumstances. So I think as a whole package, unfortunately, we can't say that we have really protected tenants during this pandemic.
Antonia, you say the moratorium has had a negative impact on landlords. Walk me through that. What experiences have you heard on the ground?
Well, look, I'm not sure we would say, so of course the eviction moratorium has had an adverse impact on some landlords, and that's simply because some landlords have had to either receive no rent or quite vastly reduced rent. But to be very clear, Patricia, we actually were supportive of the eviction moratorium. We understood the need for it. We agreed with the National Cabinet decision. We would classify it as having been a very successful legislative protection measure. What we are opposed to is an extension of that eviction moratorium beyond that September date.
Leo, those in Victoria might argue the second wave and lockdown currently justifies the moratorium extension. But states like Queensland and New South Wales have kept cases relatively low and the economic situations are improving. So why do you think those states need an extension?
Look, I think that New South Wales still has active cases. We're still having to get tested if we feel sick. We're still keeping kids home from school. We're still taking a whole lot of precautions to make sure that we don't fall into a second wave. And I think I'd also, point to the US experience right now. In May, there were 43 states had eviction moratoriums. By August, that had fallen to 20. Just last week, the CDC, the national body, enacted a nationwide eviction moratorium to make sure that there was eviction moratoriums in place everywhere for the next 4 months. They did that very specifically because even though an individual state may not have a problem right now or may not have as many cases right now, they still need to be taking this very seriously as both a health crisis and an economic crisis.
Antonia, the eviction moratoriums have been extended in South Australia and Victoria. What impact would that have on landlords if Queensland were to do it?
I think there's a couple of things I'd say. We don't see that there's a need for it. Now, that's not to suggest that there aren't tenants being impacted by COVID-19. Of course there are. We recognise that. But I think we need to understand the impact that these legislative protections have. It's a little bit too simplistic to just refer to it as an eviction moratorium. It's much more than that. What these protection measures do is they actually tie a landlord's hands behind their backs. Effectively, if you meet the COVID test, what it means is that you can't follow the normal procedures you would be allowed to follow when a tenant falls into rental arrears. And ultimately, you can't issue the necessary notices to even put them on notice that they need to pay. I think we need to consider the impact that has on landlords. We need to understand that certainly here in Queensland, the vast majority of rental properties are owned by mum and dad, everyday mum and dad investors. So it is quite a different environment to the US. We also need to consider that, yes, whilst banks have been quite good at pressing pause on mortgages, the reality is that it is only a pause, and ultimately what we know is that by pressing pause on your mortgage, just by 6 months, which is what many have done, it can in fact add $17,000 to that mortgage. So I think we need to understand, we want to be sensitive about this situation, but I think we need to understand that these are private citizens. This is not social housing that the government is providing. These are mum and dad investors who have mortgages to pay, as well as a number of other expenses that relate to that property. Another point that I think is worth making about the Queensland environment or landscape is that, of course, the median rent here in Queensland is far lower than what it is in a place like New South Wales, which is obviously where Leo resides. So a 3-bedroom house in Queensland, the median rent is about $360. So our view is that those tenants who have been impacted have the benefit of federal funding, which is, of course, consistent irrespective of where you live in Australia. So what the data tells us is the vast majority of tenants here in Queensland have actually been able to maintain their rental obligations and have been able to manage their way through this because of those federal support measures and because our median rents are a lot lower than they are in other places in the country.
Leo, on that issue, the difficulty being expressed there and the differences between the rents in different states, do you concede it is quite different?
I'm sorry, I actually can't hear Antonella at all.
Okay, well,
so I don't know what she's been saying.
Yeah,
but
well, what she said is that the rents are very different between Queensland and maybe somewhere like New South Wales. That's true, isn't it?
Look, I mean, Queensland is currently feeling the effects of a really tight rental market. Antonella knows this very well. She's been in the media talking about just how tight rental rates are in regional towns in Queensland, in the cities in Queensland. Those impacts, the impact of that tight vacancy rate means that even if the rent isn't as high as it might be in the middle of the Sydney CBD or in the middle of Melbourne, the people who are trying to find a home to live in are still finding it really tough. And we need to make sure that our rental system in Australia is one that provides homes for people as the priority. That's the fundamental purpose of this whole system.
Leo, just one more question to you before I let you both go. The initial eviction ban came with a suggestion for eligible tenants to negotiate their rent payments. Have they been able to do that, or is that sort of still a live opportunity?
There has been a range of experience, I think it's fair to say, but unfortunately, many thousands, tens of thousands of people have attempted to negotiate rent with their landlords and either been turned away, they haven't been given a true rent reduction, they've been given a rent deferral, which is really just a debt by any other name. And it's going to come back and bite them. And it already is for many people starting to kick into their ability to keep themselves housed even now. There were 26,000 rent reduction agreements lodged in Victoria in June, but we know from Tenants Victoria's studies that many people didn't even get that far because they were worried about the repercussions, they were worried about retaliation. In New South Wales, we didn't have as strong a framework around negotiations. Only 150 people went through the full process. In New South Wales, many people have informal agreements that aren't well laid out, the definitions may not be clear, and they are going to be carrying rental debts around with them potentially for years to come. And unfortunately, that is where renters become the forgotten people rather than landlords. The renters are the ones who are going to be carrying the effects of this crisis for a long time. If you come out of this still owning property, you're actually going to have done pretty well.
Okay. I'm going to have to pause it there. Thank you so much to both of you. Leo Patterson Ross there, the CEO of the New South Wales Tenants Union,